Welcome everyone to another edition of Playthrough, and on this edition it's another one of those interesting bootlegs. This is Super Mario World, or Super Mario Brothers for the Sega Genesis. Yes, the Sega Genesis version of Super Mario. Now, it has two screens to it. It has Super Mario World, and then when you press something, it then takes you to Super Mario Brothers, which you can then play one or two players. I'm not sure if they ended up doing like a modified bootleg of a bootleg, so they released it as Super Mario Brothers and then later on down the road re-released it with a Super Mario World title screen, just so they could kind of capitalize on the release of that later on. I'm not really positive. But basically, this is a bootleg that is extremely interesting because the first few levels are Mario-based, and then quickly the game goes completely the opposite direction. While it looks like Mario, it doesn't play like Mario. You can't jump on the tops of enemies' heads. In fact, you run into any enemy at all, you end up getting hurt with some of the absolute worst hit detection. And to attack enemies, you pick up boxes and use them as weapons like you would in Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. And in fact, there even is a Chip 'n Dale reference in the game. Or you can use the fireballs, which is represented by the fist at the lower part of the screen. I have two current fist attacks, which is me throwing out my fireball. One thing that is probably the worst about the game as far as the control-wise, because it does kind of move easily, jumping's okay, hit detection's an absolute mess, but what happens is when you throw a box or you end up throwing out your fireball, you immediately like slam down towards the ground. And this sometimes can cause you to accidentally like fall in the pits if you're trying to throw an object over an area when you're jumping from one platform to another. Here is the first boss of the game. Obviously, you can see it's a giant version of Bowser, and the sprite work on Bowser himself is actually not bad. It's actually a really kind of cool-looking version of Bowser. Mario's not bad himself, but a little bit weird with some of the frames of animation, especially when he ends up picking up his boxes or whatever in order to throw them at whatever enemy. That animation's a little bit off as far as the sprite on it. But basically, for this boss, we're just going to jump up and down between the two platforms. You can hold down on the D-pad in order to jump down to a previous platform or get lower or whatever it may be. And you just want to watch out for his fireballs, as well as, of course, throw the boxes that end up appearing. If you want to, you can use the fist or fireballs that you have in order to battle up any of the bosses. But if, of course, you run out, you'll then have to use whatever stage object or boss object they end up giving you. Every boss in the game ends up having some kind of item in their room for you to throw at them so that you can always make sure you'll be able to complete each boss. And even though it's a bootleg, I didn't run into any major glitching when it came to that. I didn't run into like an impossible... I ran into plenty of other random weird things, like for example here, where I can jump up and instead of being able to run across the top of an underground level like we can in the original Mario Brothers, instead we can kind of jump here and we slowly kind of sink in the platform itself, but this allows us to actually get across easily and complete most of the stage. Obviously, you notice at the end of a level, we don't actually like hit a flagpole or anything else. It just kind of teleports us to the next screen. And here we are at the third level of the second world of the game, which is another one of the Mario levels. And this is the last of the Mario themed stages. We have this, then we take on Bowser, and then it switches up completely from here on out. The bootleg version's music here in the game, it starts off with, of course, Mario music, which isn't great, but I've heard much worse. But then afterwards, in the other world's levels that we get to explore, the music changes up. I'm sure it's based on some other games and the like, including one of which, later on in the game, is a song from Donkey Kong Country, of all things. Let me know down in the comments what other music you end up hearing from the game, if there's other creatures that appear, enemies, or other stuff that you recognize from other either bootlegs or other games in general. I'd like to know a little bit more information whenever possible. Here we have this rematch against big old Bowser here. This is the same fight that we dealt with before. When I first started playing through the game, I was wondering if it was going to be like basically Mario levels and then Bowser at the end of every single world, which was going to get a bit tedious. But then I was actually surprised once I defeated Bowser the second time around, and I was able to move on to a new level. And here we go. You can see it's a very vastly different level. Could be a little bit based on Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. It kind of has that little bit of a feel to it. but still some interesting colors overall. There's also plenty of stuff in the foreground which can make some of the platforming, seeing where you're going, a bit difficult to kind of navigate. One thing you've also probably noticed is that you actually gain all your health back between levels, so it really ends up making a lot of the levels and boss fights pretty easy since you're always going to have full health. But there is plenty of other like health items and such that you'll be able to find by picking up the boxes spread around the levels. So I recommend picking up as many as possible, especially if you're a little bit low on health, but also building up those fist fireball power-ups that you can then use on the bosses. While, of course, it doesn't do any more damage than whatever the item the boss gives you, it's still an extra free hit, making some bosses go by quickly if you end up having enough of that special move in order to pull off. I love a few of the enemies throughout the course of the game, especially like the green bats during this stage, as well as like the angry Donkey Kong Jr.'s in barrels. Or at least, it looks a little bit like Donkey Kong Jr. When you make it over this part, you'll notice that there's kind of like cuts in the mountain-like platform, and when you land on it, of course, it'll start to slide downwards, so you have to quickly jump off of it. After that, we have to move our way across a few logs that are bobbing up and down the water, and some angry fish will end up popping up as we do so. While it's a little bit finicky when it comes to actually like movement and like motion in general works a little bit wonky, overall I usually don't have too many problems when it comes to platforming my way through the course of the level. When we make it to the end though, it's time for the next boss, which is this flying pig with a helicopter propeller. It ends up dropping like canteens or some kind of bottle that you'll be able to then pick up and launch at them in order to do damage. I'm also going to use, of course, my fireballs when I can in order to do damage that way. I find it funny that everything on the screen freezes when you hit one of the bosses, whether it be like not only the boss, but if he has a projectile out or other stuff that's going on the screen, it'll end up freezing for a moment when you do that. Once you take out the boss though, it's time to move on to the next world or level of the game, and this one, in the new area that we're in, of course we have kind of this weird foresty dirt themed everything that's going on. There's a lot of small little platforms and a little bit of tricky platforming, but not too difficult overall. There's also new enemies introduced, including these mole-like guys that pop up and use a shield. There's falling rocks that you can notice here, which I end up just kind of bulldozing my way through a lot of the areas of the game since you end up having so much health and can even find more throughout. As well as you have those spear throwing guys that you'll see a little bit throughout the course of the game. And they're pretty easy to jump over. They're projectiles, but jumping over any enemy in the game is difficult just because of how bad the hit detection overall is. Here we have those moving giant towers of dirt, I guess, and we have to kind of ride on them in order to get across and then jump between them as we make our way through the course of the level. There is a lot of small platforms, but they're pretty easy to like land on. Once you've gotten to this part in the game, you've probably gotten used to just how Mario ends up controlling and how you're able to kind of get him to land where you need to. Considering this is a bootleg title, it actually doesn't control all that bad. Here, make sure, of course, you ride on the platforms as they move up and down so you get to where you need to, so you'll be able to safely jump to wherever the next platform ends up being. The second half of this world, though, is a fire-themed level. You can see a lava picture background basically going on, and there are jumping fireballs that you're going to have to wait pretty much for them to jump up into the air and then go back down into the pit so you'll safely be able to cross. But overall, nothing too ridiculous. There's some spikes here that kind of pop out of the ground, but they always end up popping out as soon as they appear on screen, like whenever you get them onto the screen, so you can kind of see where they're going to be so you can easily plan your jumps accordingly. I've played a fair amount of bad bootleg games over the course of the last few months, and overall just in gaming in general, and this one, while extremely weird, and I mean very, very weird, is really not that bad, as I get chased by a series of giant boulders trying to kind of run me down here. As long as you just keep moving though, they aren't able to catch you. There's a few fireballs here that I'm able to easily kind of jump underneath when they're at their highest point. But like I was saying, overall, this is just weird, not necessarily bad. I'm sure it's based on some other bootlegs, or like I said, some other games elements are included. Let me know down in the comments though if there's any other like Sega Genesis bootlegs, as I don't have a whole lot of them that I've been able to mess with yet. So let me know if there's any other ones in particular you want to see me cover in the future. For the boss of the world here, we have this ostrich on a wheel that goes speeding back and forth. He'll drop like giant screws or bolts that we'll be able to then pick up and launch at him. There's 2 platforms. It's pretty easy to avoid him overall. If he's on the top platform, he's very easy to dodge. If he's on the bottom one, it's a little bit harder, but his head itself is not where his hit detection is, like where his hitbox is. Instead, it's like a little bit below that, so when he jumps up in the air, he'll be able to hit you, but as long as you kind of keep a little bit of a distance, you'll easily be able to avoid damage from him and beat him and move on to the next world. And this world is the most difficult. The main reason for that is this is one of the few levels that actually scrolls upwards in the game, as well as going left and right, and you kind of have to jump up in order to get the screen to go along with you. Like right here, we had to make sure that we're high enough so that the platform appears, and then there's nothing above us, but as the thing rotates and we make a nicely timed jump, we're able to kind of land up on a platform that we didn't have on screen at the moment. While this isn't necessarily that bad, it can lead to a few occasional deaths if you don't do it quite right, because if you end up falling into the abyss below, it is a death, instead of you like scrolling the screen back down and landing safely from where you came from. So whenever you're moving upwards here, you have to be very careful. There's like logs that end up appearing in the waterfalls themselves, as well as turtles, and both end up going back down into the waves or the water, so you'll have to make sure that you have enough time to quickly move your way up the platforms, whether it be the logs or the turtles. Basically, they're the same thing, except the logs just kind of stand there, and the turtles move back and forth, but they both will end up going back underneath the water, and you have to safely get across. There's 3 areas to this particular world before we end up making it to the boss. The next part here is this big giant open area with these platforms moving along set paths. Right after that, we get another rotating platform before starting to head upwards once again. Like many bootlegs, you'll also notice very similar areas to areas that we've already completed. Just, of course, easier, I'm sure, to do the overall design of the levels. But for the most part, they don't do it too much. And there actually is a surprisingly decent amount of, like, different settings and different enemies overall throughout the course of the game. Here's probably one of the more trickier areas here. We have a series of these platforms that we have to kind of make it up as we're climbing up the waterfall. After heading up, we have another little area here where it's more of these like moving platforms. Thankfully, there's like a safe platform you can kind of stand on. It's not moving. Kind of get your balance, I guess, and wait for the platforms. Either way, pretty simple stuff. I do like the way that it kind of like when the platforms are going to the right, it kind of does a weird fast scroll. It's just interesting. I don't know if the game's actually moving faster or just the game can't handle what's going on screen. Now this is the real challenge. Right here is the hardest platforming probably in the whole game, trying to get up that. If you're able to handle that, you'll be able to handle anything that this game is going to throw at you, because you have a very short window to move up those logs and get to another safe platform, and if you are off by just like a frame or two, you'll end up falling and losing a life. The third area of the stage is pretty much more of the same as far as we have the moving platforms, but then you have this kind of like gauntlet of a whole bunch of enemies. You'll have to hit these switches and you'll be able to move these platforms up and down. If the platform you jump on isn't moving at all, that just means you have to turn the switch back on, but it's nothing really too special. Here we have another one of these areas, just waiting for more moving platforms to kind of get around, but pretty simple to kind of make it to each of them. Bunch of platforms moving up and down as we continue over to the right side, and then guess what? More of the platforms on tracks. Lots of fun. Lots of variety, as you can see. Most of the game, lots of different things going on, different backgrounds, enemies, and all that. I don't know why. They didn't really need like a third stage here. I feel like if they had not included this level in particular, it wouldn't have taken anything away from the game. We could have just moved on to the boss and on to the next world. The only thing of interest is the switches that you have to hit, but it's nothing special to it. Like, you just jump on the platform, or you have to hit the button beforehand. Either way, very easy. Now, right here, I pick up an invulnerability that I can use to kind of run through enemies and through projectiles, but there's no enemies for the rest of the area, so it's weird that they end up giving that to you. Now, the next boss is this Rhino tank mix. I don't know if it's a Rhino who's part Rhino, part tank, or is it just a Rhino sticking out of a tank? But the Rhino is much bigger than the tank itself, so it's kind of just his small legs, or his legs really wrapped around and contorted and all weird. I don't know what exactly is going on. But either way, this is a relatively lengthy fight because he doesn't like to throw out the item needed in order to hit him a lot of times. He moves back and forth, firing out the left and right sides of the tank, so you want to make sure you're on the platform above or below him, depending upon where he is on screen. He'll also sometimes throw bombs out, you can then pick up the bombs and launch them at him in order to do damage. After a little bit, though, he'll eventually slide his way onto one of the moving platforms on the left or right side and go down or up to whatever the other platform he's not currently on is, and repeating the process until eventually we're able to take him out. But because it takes so long sometimes between projectiles to actually throw at him, this is probably the lengthiest fight. And it's funny because they make it really difficult because of that in this fight, and then the final two bosses of the game that we'll be moving on to, it's actually very easy to get the item needed to hit them, and they're much easier boss fights than this one ends up being. In fact, this is maybe the hardest boss because of that in the game. Like I mentioned, it will take forever probably, unless you have a lot of the fist fireballs going into the battle, but once that Rhino is taken care of, we move on to the next world, which is the proverbial staple of platform games, the haunted graveyard style of level. This is another level that's broken up into 3 different parts. The weird spinning candles are one of the more interesting enemies, along with the creepy cat, demon, ghost, whatever thing it is, thing of plasma. It's really goofy looking, and sometimes they're difficult to actually get around them when dealing with them. Here we use the jack-in-the-box like spring to bounce our way up to the top portion of the stage and then continue along the top here. Plenty of boxes for us to pick up if we need to take out anything in our way. Overall, though, this is a much easier level to deal with. Make sure you don't land on the spikes on the tops of some platforms. It doesn't look like necessarily they would, but yeah, they end up hurting you. Now, in the next section, you have these platforms that go out and then retract. But they start while they're extended, so when you get them on screen, they then start to retract back. So if you move too quickly, it'll end up coming back and you'll end up falling down into the pit. So be careful, make sure they start moving back and forth and then quickly get back to a safe point on the platform and then continue to make your way across. When you make it over here, you have a series of like staircases. We're going to work our way up. There is a bat kind of chasing us here, but it's nothing to really worry about. Now this part right here is the hardest part of the level because these ghost things, there's no boxes, and they're very hard to dodge. Of course, you can use your fireballs if you do have them, but I like to save them as much as possible, and thankfully there's some health right after that section, but a little bit difficult just to try to avoid the enemies that are there. Here, use another spring to bounce our way to the top, and that finishes up the level, and we move on to the third part of the haunted themed stage, which is a castle. Here, we're going to take the upper path. We can jump over that small wall and continue along. I don't think that was what they intended, but very easy to do so. Taking these upper paths, though, allows us to kind of bypass a bunch of the lower platform enemies. Here we have a couple of areas that have these electrified fish guys that kind of get in the way. A little bit tricky to dodge them just because the hitbox ends up being so big on them. Either way, we're just going to keep on jumping through, and right here we're going to jump, and this is the end of the level here that we make it to. And it's time for the next boss, which we're going to use the fireballs on him, as well as these bells that just keep spawning. This is what we need to kill him, and all he does is float back and forth. That's all he's doing, moving back and forth, left and right. All you gotta do is jump in the air, fire fireballs at him, pick up the bells and use them, and this guy goes down in a couple of seconds, like 1/10 the time that it took us to beat the previous boss, and this guy's done, and we're moving on to the final world of the game. The final world of the game is a construction-themed level. It has a couple of enemies to deal with, such as the ball-throwing guys with the hats. I don't know, they're kind of weird looking. You also have like the muscle duck enemies that we've seen multiple times throughout the course of the game. Right here we have a box that kind of like has legs in it, like it's basically someone inside the box that you have to watch out for. Thankfully the boxes are different shades of brown, so you can kind of tell which ones are fake and which ones are real. But one thing that is funny is that the enemies all have names, and you get an enemy roll call at the end of the game once you beat it. And that enemy is actually called Dale, so I wonder if it's actually supposed to be like, you know, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, but that's actually supposed to be them inside of the box because of the way the enemy is. Also interesting to note, though, there is an enemy called Chip, but it doesn't look like those. After completing that part of the stage, we move on to the next one, which has conveyor belts thrown into the mix, as well as the other enemies that we've been dealing with. The conveyor belts work pretty good, no issues, so very easy to kind of jump on them, and whatever way they're going to push and pull you, you can easily kind of manipulate Mario so that you can get past safely. The enemy that ends up being the final boss is another pretty easy boss. Not as easy as the one we just dealt with, but another one that's pretty easy. And if you can take a lot of the fist into the fight, the better. And the main reason for that is just because it's a little bit difficult to actually grab the object or whatever he ends up dropping in his room because he ends up taking up so much space on screen. Now we're in the final level of the game, the final area of the game. Nothing new really thrown at us as far as the whole construction stage theme is going on. There are some moving platforms back and forth. There's, of course, some giant pits. And we do have to head upwards here, but it's a very easy kind of path to follow upwards as we go back and forth between the conveyor belts. Be careful, of course, because if you end up falling, it will end up costing you a life, which we have built up quite a few lives during the course of the game, though. Here, wait until the giant beam moves down so that you can easily get to it. And then continue along more conveyor belts, making your way over to the right side. After just a little bit more platforming, we make it to the end of the stage here on this conveyor belt, and it's time for the final boss of the game, this giant elephant. He's looking pretty dapper, though, with his like vest and hat on. I'm going to use all my fireballs on him, but all he does is jump back and forth. And since he takes up so much space, that's what makes him difficult to actually get underneath of him, pick up the giant hammers in order to throw at him. But once you deliver the final hit, you can sit back and enjoy the ending to Super Mario World on the Genesis. Well, to be honest, there really isn't an ending. It's just the enemy roll call that you get to see and then the credits. But the enemy roll call is so funny just because you have the bee enemies named Chip. These guys, the walking box leg things, are named Dale. You then have the guys that threw the balls out at you with the hats. They're named Jeff, of all things. I guess they just picked a generic American name to have as them. The angry fish are named Hardy. We then have ourselves the angry happy bat thing, which they named Matthew. Once again, I just think they just took a random American name and they're like, that works. We then have a snake named Danelle, or Danelle. I don't know if it's supposed to be Daniel or Danielle, but Dan-L. Corey, the monkey. The monkey's named Corey. But don't worry, my favorite is still coming up. We have Eugene, or Eugoon. I guess it's Eugoon, but I think they were going for Eugene when naming the mole guys. But here it is. The spinning candles are named Dick. I guess, once again, just American name, but still. The evil killer plasma ghost cat things are named Belle. Then this guy is named Candle. Yep, the electrified fish guys that shock us are named Candle. The candle is named Dick, and the fish is named Candle. We then get the spear-throwing guys named Bruno, and last but certainly not least, the muscle duck guys named Wang. And these are just the enemies that were originally created, of course, for the game. They don't show the roll call for all of the Mario-based enemies we saw at the beginning of the game. And then we get our credits here by Jazz Dark, apparently, which they have some like chibi versions, I guess, of some of the creators here, or just some artwork for them. Not too big of a credit sequence before we end up making it to the end at the bottom. I wonder, though, if this was like another game altogether, and then they just added the Mario-based levels to make it a Mario bootleg unlicensed thing, but either way, that's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, guys, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.